Hey everybody, this is the fourth here, and in this video I just wanted to go into a little bit more depth about reference mixing, specifically the bass. Now, mixing bass can be a little bit tricky even if you are reference mixing, if you don't know certain things about how your monitoring tools work. And this is what I will be addressing in this video to hopefully help you get better results from reference mixing. So let's say I'm mixing a track and this is my bass. This nice big sub bass. And I'm using this track here as a reference track. So what I want to do, if I don't really trust my ears or my monitors or whatever, is I want to bring up my spectrum analyzers. So I have the Vox and Ghost band spectrum analyzer, and then I have a spectrogram over here. And I definitely recommend to use both together to just get a really complete idea of how your audio spectrum is looking. And like I mentioned before in the reference mixing video, I would suggest turning down the average time on Vox and Ghost band to a point where it responds pretty quickly to the peaks, but not so quickly that it's impossible to tell where they are. So 134 looks pretty good to me. It responds pretty quickly, but it's not too quick. So this is my sub bass. And I want to match its loudness with the reference track. So I'm going to play the reference track. And I'll see that it's kind of sustaining right at about -30. And you can see that down here. And it's just slightly over -30. So I want to set my bass to be that loud as well. Okay, so according to this is where my bass should be. And let's say that I mixed it this way, I finished the mix, and I went to go check it out on my car stereo or some stereo that has a really good bass presence. And when I play it on that sound system, I discover that, whoa, it's way too loud. You know, the bass just overwhelms the rest of the mix. Whereas in this track, hypothetically, it wasn't. So what's the deal? You know, I mixed the sub bass to be the same level according to the spectrum analyzer, and yet it sounds way too loud. And the reason that this happens is because the frequency presence you see on the spectrum analyzer is weighted in such a way that it more closely matches how we hear sound. And you can see this if I change the pitch of this sine wave. It's going to be peaking at the same level over here. But if you pay attention to how it changes on the spectrum analyzer, you'll see that it actually increases in level as I increase the pitch. And you can see it's still peaking at the same level, but it shows as being a much higher level on the spectrum analyzer. And this can cause some problems while trying to mix your bass. Because as I just explained, you know, if I were to mix this bass down here at the same level according to the spectrum analyzer as this bass, I would probably end up mixing it in quite a bit too loud. So how do you avoid this problem? And there are a few things you can do. The best thing to do would be to use a reference track that is in the same key or just slightly off the key of the track that you're mixing. So if I'm mixing a song with a bass that is this low-pitched C, I'd probably want to use a reference track that uses a low-pitched C like that, or maybe C sharp or D. And you can see that when I play those notes on the spectrum, they all show at about the same level. And once I get too high, it starts going quite a bit higher. And it would be best if this is something you did from the beginning, if you started mixing using a good reference track that has a bass playing the same root note as your bass line. But if not, what you can do is load in a new reference track, and you have to make sure that you do like the bass, because if you're referencing a track where you don't really like the bass, or the bass isn't as powerful as you would like in that reference track, you're going to have problems. Even if you do a good job of reference mixing, you won't like the bass in your track simply because you didn't like the bass in the reference track. So you would want to spend some time choosing a reference track for the bass and bring that in, and make sure you set it at the same apparent loudness level as your track. So it's just really important that you make sure that the loudness of this other reference track is about the same as the loudness of your original reference track if you had to bring in a second reference track and the track that you've been mixing. So if I use this as my second reference track, I can see that the bass is peaking on that low frequency. It's at about -33. So if I play my bass is actually already there. So I might drop it down a little bit. Yeah, I might drop it down just slightly to help it match that level a little bit better. Now, this is the most reliable of the techniques I'll be showing you in this video. So I strongly recommend you do it this way if you can. Just use a reference track with a bass that is in the same key, give or take a semitone or two, as the track you are mixing. But if for any reason you aren't able to do this, if you aren't able to find a good reference track that is in the same key, then these other techniques I'm about to talk about should help you get your bass about right. They just aren't going to be quite as reliable as doing this method, which I just explained. But another thing you could do is, if I'm mixing in just a pure sine sub bass as my bass in my track, I could use the reference track. And I'll see it's peaking at -30. And what I'd do is I'd play my bass on the same note as the bass plays in the reference track. So the reference track plays on G. And so that's where I'm going to play my bass while I set the level. So the bass was peaking at just over -30 in the spectrum. And I'm going to try to set my bass to be that same level. And you can see right now it's just under, so I want to boost that a little bit. And I think it's a little bit too much, so I'm going to bring that down just slightly. So that's pretty good. And then what I would want to do is leave this sine wave raw. I wouldn't want to boost or cut any frequency ranges, because that's going to change the power of the sub bass. And the problem with doing it this way is it won't always work for all basses. It's pretty reliable if you have a pure sine sub bass as your bass. But if you have a very harmonically rich bass, it's going to be a lot more complicated. So if neither of these two previous options work for you, the next thing you would want to do is change the weighting of your spectrum analyzer plugin. And basically you'd want to turn the weighting off and just have it show the real amplitude values of your various frequencies. And so how you do this will depend on what plugin you're using. So that's something you should read the manual or look up. But if you're using Span, you just go to Edit, and then this slope is what adjusts that frequency response. And what you want to do is set it to 0. Or as close to 0 as possible. So 0.01 is close enough. And you will see that the representation on this graph of the song changes quite a bit. It's changed so much that I actually now have to edit my amplitude range. So I'm going to turn up the amplitude range. And so this is going to provide me with a more accurate representation of the different amplitudes in my track. And I could mix in my bass, because you'll see if I sweep this bass now, before when it increased in amplitude, that's not going to happen. You can see that it showed the same value regardless of the pitch I was on. And so now I can kind of trust this to mix in my bass a lot better. And as it just so happens, my bass is already mixed at the same level. Now you will hear that it sounds different to the bass in the reference track, and that's just because the bass in the reference track has more harmonics than this pure sine sub-bass. And if you're having trouble getting the harmonics in a certain bass to sound right compared to your reference track, then I recommend you watch one of the later videos in the section of the tutorial, which is all about recreating a bass. And I'll go into more depth about how you can recreate a bass and really get the same sound as another bass that you really like. So hopefully this video helps you out and helps you avoid certain mistakes that you might make while reference mixing your bass.